Good morning. It is good to see everyone again this morning. We have been involved in a several week study looking at forgiveness. We're going to continue that today and wrap it up next week. And want to start off looking at 1 Samuel chapter 26. Now, just to give us some context, throughout the book of 1 Samuel, Saul, who is the king of Israel, has been perpetually jealous of David. David is a young man, probably somewhere in his late 20s by this point, mid to late 20s. And David actually was in Saul's service for a while. When the Israelites went up against the Philistines and against their giant Goliath, David came out and beat him when nobody else in the army was able to do that or willing to go against him. And because of this, the Israelites began singing a refrain, a song that was very offensive to Saul. They said, Saul has killed his thousands, but David his tens of thousands. And so it complicated matters a little further that Saul's son Jonathan was David's best friend. And it also complicated things a little bit more that David had married into Saul's family, marrying his daughter. And as they go through these cycles, Saul becomes jealous of David, and it creates this conflict that often rises to the level that David has to run away to get away from Saul. And at this point in 1 Samuel, David's been on the run for Saul for quite some time. And so when we enter into this text, it says, Now the Ziphites came to Saul at Gibeah, saying, Is David not hiding in the hill of Hachilah opposite Jeshimon? Then Saul arose and went down to the wilderness of Ziph, having 3,000 chosen men of Israel with him to seek David in the wilderness of Ziph. And Saul encamped in the hill of Hachilah, which is opposite of Jeshimon by the road. But David stayed in the wilderness, and he saw that Saul came after him into the wilderness. David therefore sent out spies and understood that David had indeed come. And so David goes to his men and he says, okay, I need somebody to go with me. We're going to go down into Saul's camp and spy it out. And a young man named Abishai says, I'll go with you. And so verse 7, David and Abishai come to the people by night, and there Saul lay sleeping within the camp with his spear stuck in the ground by his head. And Abner and the people lay all around him. Now Abner was Saul's general. He was his commander. Then Abishai said to David, God has delivered your enemy into your hand this day. Now therefore, please let me strike him once with the spear right to the earth, and I will not have to strike him a second time. So they sneak into this camp. They get right up on top of Saul, who's laying there sleeping, spear stuck in the ground beside him. And Abishai says, David, let me take this spear, and all it's going to take is one shot, and that's it. Your problems are over. Well, David replies to Abishai, and he says, do not destroy him. For who can stretch out his hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? David said, furthermore, as the Lord lives, the Lord shall strike him, or his day shall come to die, or he shall go out into battle and perish. The Lord forbid that I should stretch my hand out against the Lord's anointed. But please take now the spear and the jug of water that are by his head, and let us go. And so they take the jug of water, they take the spear, and they sneak out, and they go to the outer edge of the camp to a safe distance away. And when they get a safe distance away, David yells out, hey! But he's not yelling out to Saul, he's yelling out to Abner, the general, whose job it is to protect the king. And he says, hey, Abner, what's going on? Looks like you didn't do your job. You know, you and all your men probably deserve to die for this. And Saul's hearing this, and in verse 17, it says, Then Saul knew David's voice and said, "Is that your voice, my son David?" And David said, "It is my voice, my Lord, O king." And he said, "Why does the Lord thus pursue his servant? For the king of Israel has come out to seek a flea, as when one hunts a partridge in the mountains." And so David says, "Yeah, it's me, Saul. Why are you doing this? Why are you doing this? I'm nothing to you. You're the king, okay? I'm nothing to you." And then Saul said, "I've sinned. Return, my son David, for I will harm you no more, because my life was precious in your eyes this day. Indeed, I have played the fool and erred exceedingly." And David answered and said, "Here is the king's spear. Let one of the young men come over and get it. And may the Lord repay every man for his righteousness and his faithfulness, for the Lord delivered you into my hand today, but I would not stretch out my hand against the Lord's anointed." And then David said to Saul, "May you be blessed, my son David. You shall do great things and also still prevail." And so David went on his way, and Saul returned to his palace. Now, I want you just to hold this story in the back of your mind, because there's a really important detail in this that we're going to come back to in just a little bit as we talk about forgiveness. Again, just by way of quick review, why are we talking about forgiveness? Well, the reality is that as humans, we hurt each other. People hurt me, and I hurt other people. And to engage another person is to open yourself up to the possibility of being hurt. In other words, if we're involved in relationships, things are going to happen that are going to bother us or offend us. And sometimes the wounds are cruel and deep and intentional, and other times the person who hurt us may not even know that they've hurt us. And it's important that we understand that God made us as holistic beings, physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. So forgiveness is a key component in processing the damage that's done to us in this life in a healthy way. In other words, without forgiveness, we can't be spiritually healthy. We can't be emotionally healthy. We can't be physically healthy. And so what is forgiveness? Well, my best stab at a definition is this. It's taking the pain of a wound, of something that has hurt you, and handing it over to God to carry because I can't carry it. And that, when I hand it to God, that frees me to graciously give and receive pardon and do my best to live in the present and to take back my power and my dignity by releasing the burden of the wound. Now, some important things to remember is that forgiveness is never, ever, ever for the sake of the other person, because you cannot control anybody but you. Forgiveness is always for my sake. It's always for me, to give me peace. Forgiveness is a process that takes time. So give yourself grace. When you are hurt, if you don't get over it a second later, that's okay. It's a grief process and it takes time. And if you can't immediately forgive and forget, that doesn't mean you're a bad Christian. It doesn't mean you're a bad person, because this is a process that takes time. Last week, we began talking about the fourfold path to forgiveness, and this framework is outlined by Desmond Tutu in his book, The Book of Forgiving, and it is very much steeped in Scripture, and I think he does a great job of taking what God shares with us and outlining it. And his fourfold path, he says, you tell the story. You talk about what hurt you, because having a voice gives you value. You name the hurt. You talk about the specific ways that this affected you, because that helps you to process it emotionally. Then you grant forgiveness, which is a part of recognizing our shared humanity, and then you renew or release the relationship. Now, last week we talked about those first two, telling the story and naming the hurt. And when we follow through with this fourfold path, what it does is when there's a hurt, and then we have pain that results from that hurt, we're at a point where we make a choice. If we choose to harm, to retaliate, to seek revenge, we get just trapped in this nasty cycle. But if we make the other choice to follow this fourfold path, it leads to healing. So, granting forgiveness. You know, it seems like this is the easiest part of the process, but this is oftentimes the hardest part of the process. It's to take the pain that we suffered and then to actually be able to say to somebody, I forgive you. So how do we do this? Why is this important? How do we do this? It's important because granting forgiveness is, again, always for your sake. It's what keeps us from being stuck in that loop of pain. It's the idea of, if it were a physical wound, it's the idea of granting forgiveness as cleaning out the wound to allow it to heal versus just slapping a Band-Aid over it and pretending like it's not there. And so when we forgive, we're making a conscientious choice to say that I'm going to hand this to God and let Him be the one in control instead of me trying to be the one in control. And so when we make that choice, understand that choice that doesn't condone the action that hurt me. It doesn't say this was okay when I forgive. But what it does is it says I'm going to accept the reality that this happened. This is something that can't be changed, and now I'm going to be able to start moving on from this. How do we do it? You know, it's easy to talk about forgiveness, but how do we actually do it? A couple of things that I think are really important is one thing that we need to do is that we need to, in all of our relationships, try to create an environment of forgiveness. And what I mean by that is in any relationships that we have, there are always going to be little things that hurt us. When I think about my relationship with Lisa, we've been married for 20-something years, and 26, I know. And if both of us, if we wanted to, we could consistently be hurt and offended by each other. Because we do little things here and there that bother each other. But we choose to live in an environment of forgiveness, meaning that we're going to let go of those little things that come up because those are less important than our relationship. And when we learn to develop that environment of forgiveness and we let go of those little things, then when bigger things come up, it still hurts, but it's a whole lot easier to work through those things. Now, we live in a culture right now that tells you need to be offended by everything. Everything ought to bother you, and you ought to be hurt by everything. And I will say there are some things we do need to be offended by. We need to be offended by things like blatant racism. We need to be offended by people perpetuating hate. We need to be offended by things that we see that are cruel, are wrong. We need to be offended by those things. But I don't want to raise my children being hurt by every little thing. I don't want my kids to feel like they need to walk around all day long going, well, you owe me an apology. I'm going to be mad at you till I get it. That's no way to live. So, developing an environment of forgiveness within your relationships helps us to be able to forgive big things as well as the little things. Another thing that becomes very important, and this is one of the things that Tutu talks about in the book, is there anything within this other person who's hurt me that can elicit empathy? Is there anything that's going on with this person that I can look at them and I can understand why? Now that doesn't justify the action. That doesn't justify what you did to hurt me. But if I can understand the why behind it, it does make forgiveness a lot easier. A couple of weeks ago, I shared with y'all that at a church Lisa and I were at, we were hurt. There was a person there who was in a leadership position who just told some blatant lies about us, who did some things to hurt us. And I don't condone what he did in any way. But when I looked at his family was a train wreck. And when I saw that, I understood that in a church context, that was one of the few places where he felt like he could have power and control, because the rest of his life was out of control. Again, it didn't take away the pain, but it made me able to look at him and say, okay, at least I understand why he's doing what he's doing. So, forgiveness, it's not easy. But the more we develop that environment within our families, within our church, within our community, then the easier it is to live in peace with each other and in that forgiveness with each other. You know, the idea, you've probably heard this before, but withholding forgiveness, when we just, no, I'm not going to do that for you, it's like drinking poison and then waiting for the other person to die. Because that hurt is just going to kill you from the inside. The next thing that Tutu talked about in his book was the idea of renewing or releasing the relationship. And one of the questions that comes up all the time with this is, am I a bad Christian if I let the relationship go? Have I failed in some way if I've let this relationship end? Let's go back to David. In this occurrence of David with Samuel, remember, this is a cycle that's been going on and on and on. Saul's been pursuing David, and then he'll have these highlight moments of, oh, David, I'm so sorry I was wrong, come back into my service. And some of the times David did come back into his service. After a while, David started going, I'm not so sure about this. But we get to the end of chapter 26, and it looks like that Saul has this big repentant moment, right? And maybe he did, I don't know. But when we move into chapter 27, the first few verses, listen to what David says. And David said in his heart, now I shall perish someday by the hand of Saul. There is nothing better for me than that I should speedily escape to the land of the Philistines, and Saul will despair for searching for me to seek me any more in the land of Israel. So I shall escape out of his hand. And it was told Saul that David had fled to Gath, so he sought him no more. In other words, here's what David said. This cycle's going to kill me. Every time I go back into relationship with this man, he hurts me again. And each time is worse than the last. And if I don't do something to break this relationship, I'm going to be perpetually stuck. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. This text was freeing for me when I read that. I don't want to break relationships. I want to maintain good relationships. But I was taught a very shallow theology of forgiveness growing up, that forgive and forget. You just pretend like it didn't happen and you just go right back to the person. You go right back. That's your Christian duty. You go right back. And sometimes we can't do that. Sometimes God doesn't want us to do that. God doesn't want us to put us in a situation where we're continually hurt or abused or put down or demeaned or crushed in some way. That's not what God calls us to. That's not holy. That's not good. And so sometimes we do have to release the relationship. So, again, the ideal is, if you can, to renew the relationship. And let me tell you that I think it's really important here that Tutu uses the word renew rather than resume. We don't want to resume a relationship that's broken, because then you're just going back into the brokenness. You want to renew it. You want it to be different so that it can be healthy, right? And so things that can make it difficult to renew a relationship is it's going to take effort on both sides. Both people have to be involved in the relationship getting better and being renewed. Renewing a relationship is fearful. It really is. What if he or she hurts me again? Am I being a fool for giving this person a second chance? Will being with the one who wounded me really bring healing? And so it's a fearful endeavor sometimes to renew that relationship. Those are all legitimate questions. But here's the thing. When we forgive and when we can renew those relationships, we show the world Christ at work within us. We show that God is reconciling the world back to Him. Renewing is always, always, always going to be preferred, but not always possible. And so, when it's not possible or beneficial or good for us to do that, when the other person's unrepentant, when we can't find peace, we may have to release a relationship. And that's always going to be tough, because when we have to release a relationship, we're going to grieve the pain of lost time, of emotional investment in that person. There may be family ties that go deep, even when we have to release a relationship. I mean, think about David. Again, he's got to break this relationship with Saul, but Saul's son is his best friend. Saul's daughter is his wife. Even later on, we see that Saul's grandson comes into David's care. And so David, he's got to walk that tricky balance of maintaining a relationship with people he still does love and care for, and this relationship that he has to release. And that's not easy. Forgiveness, it seems like such a simple concept, doesn't it? But it's not. But it's important for us to understand that God is with us in this process. You know, we go through this process of telling the story, of naming the hurt, of forgiving, and then of deciding, can we renew this relationship or do we have to release it? And that takes time and that takes effort, and that's not easy. But God is with us. God is with us in that process. And what God's calling us to is to be as much like His nature as we can be. He is a loving and forgiving God. He will take away our sins and remember them no more. And no matter what offenses we have against each other, we have so many more against God. And He says, but you're okay. We're going to keep renewing this relationship. We're going to keep helping to mold you into who you need to be. And this morning, if we can help you in any way in that relationship with God, let us do that as we stand and sing this invitation song.